Okay, so that's the Austrian theory. So Krugman is saying, well, yeah, that it's internally consistent, it's logically coherent, but empirically I don't think that that's what's going on in modern recessions. And one of the things Krugman said that in his mind was evidence for the Keynesian explanation and against the Austrian is he said, well, if the Austrians are right, why is it that the empirical research shows that central banks can affect real GDP and that central banking policy influences the course of the real economy? All right, and I mean, if you think about it, that's crazy. That he's, you know, I can't even think of a good analogy because he's saying if the Austrians are right, why is it that central banks can cause the business cycle? Right, and that's what the Austrians are saying is that. So that's the thing is that Krugman is citing something, so it shows he doesn't even understand what the theory is, and what's happening there, it's because in mainstream economics they usually classify business cycle theories as either monetary or real. Okay, and so they had this theory called the real business cycle theory, and there it's associated with certain people like in the University of Rochester and University of Chicago. And so some of those guys are very extreme in their views, and they will go so far as to say that the central bank, you know, can only affect nominal magnitudes, right? So they can only affect the absolute number that you put on price stickers, but they don't affect anything real, meaning they don't affect you know, how many hours of labor exchanged for a car, or they don't affect how many tomatoes exchanged for apples. Okay, so they're saying all that the central bank can do is affect the rate of price inflation. They don't affect any of the relationships among other things. And so that's where Krugman's coming from. So in his mind, he thought the Austrians are talking about tangible machinery and things, so that's a real theory, and so therefore the Austrians must believe that the central bank has no influence on the business cycle at all. All right, and that's why in Krugman's mind, if I can point to research papers showing that no, when the central bank lowers interest rates, that really does make real GDP grow faster for a few quarters, and when the central bank raises interest rates, it really does cause unemployment to go up. He thinks that's refuting the Austrians, but again, that's because in his mind, it's either a monetary theory or a real theory. It can't be both. And what Fritz Machlup said is that, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, I think, he said that the Austrian theory, the business cycle is caused by monetary forces, but it consists of real phenomena. Okay, so in other words, yes, it's the central bank pumping in money or not pumping it in as fast that influences what stage you are in the business cycle, but the business cycle itself is not just about what numbers you read on price tags. There are real distortions, that too much capital and labor go into certain industries, certain sectors, and then, you know, in the bust, those resources need to flow out of those sectors and go elsewhere in the economy. All right? And so that's why, in the Austrian view, it's the boom period where the mistakes are made, where the malinvestments are made, because entrepreneurs are misled by the wrong interest rate, and so you can't avoid there being a recession. That's impossible. The most you can do is stimulate even more and just prolong the artificial boom and make the necessary correction that much more intense. All right, so that's where Krugman was coming from, is he thought that the Austrians were saying this is purely a real thing and has nothing to do with money, but in fact, you know, the Austrians think that they have the proper theory, that it's naive, it's not just one or the other, it's that money is important, money serves a real function in the economy, it does something useful, you need money, but if you mess with it, then it's going to cause real disturbances, and so that's why you can't just fix things like that. You can't just institute the correct central bank policy and cure all the malinvestments that were made during the boom period, because there were, you know, too many resources went into housing, for example, too many went into the financial sector, and you can't just magically make those mistakes disappear just because you switched the correct monetary policy. So just to underscore that, I mean, you can't understand the Austrian position on various matters like the business cycle unless you understand Austrian capital theory. So for that, I have an essay, if you haven't read it yet, it's called The Importance of Capital Theory at Mises.org, so I would recommend that, you know, if you're going to read one thing based on this lecture, that would be the article to read. So if you just Google Robert Murphy, The Importance of Capital Theory, you'll hit it. And there's a picture of sushi near the top of the article, so that's the one, for those of you who've seen, that's the one I'm talking about. So there I give a simple little fable or parable about an island economy where Paul Krugman washes up on shore and starts advising them and misleads them, and they expand in some sectors, and they have a boom and then a collapse, and there's unemployment. And I have real numbers plugged in so you can think through and see the whole scenario. So that's what happens in that article, but it just shows you the importance of thinking through the fact that in an economy, it's not just that there's aggregate demand, that people go to the store and spend money, and then those goods are just magically on the shelves. That there's a temporal sequence that in order for you to go to the store with your purchasing power and for there to be a television set on the shelf, that had to have been produced in the past, right? Workers had to have capital resources, they had to have inputs, circuit boards, whatever, the things you use to make a television set, the tools that had to have been accumulated beforehand. Someone has to drive the truck from the manufacturing plant to the store, and so on, right? And so these things, a mainstream economist would say, okay, yeah, sure, you need all that stuff, but they don't integrate that into their analysis, and that's why the Austrians say these guys miss the importance, and they don't understand what's going on during a recession. All right, now before I have 3 episodes here of where the Keynesians and the Austrians had disagreements about what would happen with the employment situation. But before I talk about those, let me just give you I don't know if you want to call it the epistemological foundation of this. So it's not that we're saying here, or that I'm saying, because the Austrians predicted better, therefore their theory is superior. Because as the earlier speakers were saying, in terms of the epistemology here, it's the Austrians are not subscribers to the naive positivist view that the way you discover truth in economics is by coming up with falsifiable predictions, and then whichever theory fits the data the best is the correct theory. But it is useful to point out that the Austrians, since we think they have a correct theory, they can navigate through the world more successfully than the Keynesians can. So just to give you an analogy, if you study geometry, you go to school and they're teaching you about the Pythagorean theorem and things like that, the method there is it starts with axioms, and it's logically deduced, and you come up with theorems. And if you understand how the proof works, it would be silly to say to your teacher, well, can we go test this? Let's go start looking at real triangles and make sure that it's true. If that's the way you're thinking, then you haven't understand what the proof did, okay? But at the same time, geometry is definitely useful in the world. If somebody is going to be an engineer and go build a bridge, and he says to you that, yeah, here's the bridge, you can drive your car over it, and by the way, I got a C+ when I took geometry, you might be a little bit concerned, right? So the point is, even though geometry is a logically deductive, a priori enterprise, I don't know if you want to call it a science, but it's a discipline of thought, it has impact in the real world, that you successfully navigate in the real world better in certain types of things you want to do if you have studied geometry. So it's really, philosophically, it's very interesting. It's almost like if you just sit in a corner and think, then you can go and be more successful. It's sort of interesting that that's the way the world is, but it seems to be that way. And so it's the same thing with Austrian economics. It's true that you don't test the validity of basic principles in Austrian economics by going out and looking at empirical data, but if you think through the consequences of the thought experiments that the Austrian writers discuss in their works, then I think that gives you a framework that you look out at the world and you can interpret economic data with that and be more successful. Another example, just so you understand where I'm coming from with this, even though the Austrian business cycle theory, you could think it through and say, yeah, that's a logically coherent theory, it makes sense. Krugman is right that even though it's internally consistent, maybe it's not what's going on in the real world. So that's another possibility. So it's not that we're testing to see if the theory is right or wrong, but maybe in the real world there are other influences, and that's what makes things happen that we conventionally describe as a bubble or that we describe as mass unemployment. Maybe there are other things going on. So for example, probably when we look at the data for this last quarter, in Japan, their industrial output's going to be way down, and probably their unemployment's going to be way up. But that's not going to be because of their central bank. It's going to be because they got hit with a tsunami and the earthquake, right? So you can see that just because major things happen to an economy, that by itself, and that you think Austrian business cycle theory is correct, it doesn't mean every major disturbance is because of this particular mechanism. Okay, so that's why I think it's important to occasionally check and make sure, as Austrians, are we able to grapple with these typical employment data better than the Keynesians, or maybe we're arguing correctly about some valid thing that's really not that significant. Okay, so the first episode I want to talk about is when President Obama first comes in, and incidentally, I'm going to be dealing with the United States because, again, I'm a typical American. I don't even know that the rest of the world has employment, so we're just going to focus on U.S. data here, U.S. episodes. So President Obama comes in. It was inaugurated in early 2009, and at that point in the United States, the unemployment rate, the national average, and of course the numbers are bogus, but the official figures, the unemployment rate was 7% in change, 7.3%, something like that. And so they were proposing a major stimulus, because in a Keynesian framework, what's the problem? We have insufficient aggregate demand. So how do you fix it? Well, obviously the government needs to run a big deficit to get total spending up to create jobs. That was the Keynesian analysis and prescription. And so Obama's team, and one of the chief researchers on the team was Christina Romer, who incidentally was involved with Peter Klein's dissertation. What was it? She wasn't on your committee, but she was, well, an advisor. Okay, so you can understand, yeah, so you can understand Peter's Keynesian tendencies. So she's, but in all seriousness, she did have some important macro work, and then we were talking about this, that she did what she needed to do to get on Obama's team. But so she had this the model. You can go and see. I put this in a few of my articles to show you the diagrams. They're trying to convince the American people that, look, we need to have this $787 billion stimulus. I think the number they were throwing around at the time, which nowadays that doesn't sound like a big number, but back then that was huge numbers, as we've been desensitized with QEs and all this about these huge numbers. But back then, for the government, not because we're in a war or something, but just to go spend $787 billion of money it doesn't have, it has to go borrow to help the economy, and that was outrageous.